What happened to that one kid I used to hang with all the time?
Woo! That's it, Hale.
Hello, my name is RaMell Ross, the director of Nickel Boys. I'm here at the IndieWire studio with the Filmmaker Toolkit podcast with my guy Chris. We're going to talk for a while, but before that, I'm going to play the harmonica.
When you were on for HALE County, I remember, and I don't want to be reductive here, but there was an element of, there's kind of three big things here. One was the photograph, you know, how you're a photographer and some of the things that you were doing in photography, how could you get that into the filmic image? There was also this idea of you were following around two boys for, I think, what was it, into their manhood, like 5-7 years. Mm-hmm. And there was that thing what all docs do is like, how do we, there's events in their lives, let's not reduce them to the narrative, exactly. You know, and they have significant things happened in their lives, but you don't want it to suddenly be everything led up to that, which I think is something that a lot of documentary filmmakers. Mm-hmm. And then there was also the wrestling with, you know, the Black image and representational in cinema, mm-hmm. which is obviously a loaded subject. And those things that you were really pouring over in your head resulted in you doing something really new that I had never seen before. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, using that as a jumping off point, what you were able to do in HALE County, how much of that was a jumping off point for some of the things that you were doing with Nickel Boys?
Yeah, it not only is like a jumping off point, it's like just the only foundation I have for making something that I can watch every day. Something that is like, you know, my memories as well as Daniel and Quincy's memories, as well as the landscapes memories, as well as the documents memories, as well as history's memories, like all of these things. It's kind of the only way, at least at that point, and at this point, I kind of know how to get to what I'm interested in. And so there are 3 scenes in HALE County this evening that were used as proof of concept for how POV would be, because it's not an easy sell. I must say, thinking back, it probably was the easiest possible sell with the producers we were working with, mm-hmm. considering that they never, ever questioned me. They stress test things, but of course, you're trying to make the best film possible. And so, yeah, it is HALE County. You know, one idea I think Joss and I had talked about early in the writing process was like, what if Elwood and Turner had their own cameras to document their own lives at that time, right? There's not much visual poetry from Black folks' perspectives that exist in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, at least popularly shared. And so what's their life like from their eyes?
You mentioned Jocelyn. Jocelyn's producer who very much helped. I don't think anybody else was going to make HALE County, but also help. There's a difference between making it, but also helping you figure out what that language is, mm-hmm. and kind of surround you with people with that, rather than, because I'm sure there's a lot of people that could have turned that into a more standard doc.
Yeah.
Talk about, because she played a similar role with this one, but then obviously you're dealing with adapting a very successful book and turning that into a scripted narrative. I'm wondering if you could talk about that process, because I know she took a co-writing credit on this one, but I mean, I have to ask if this is true. The script started off with photographs? Is that that was the first thing?
Yeah, and all photographs. And I, you know, being the person that doesn't want to disappoint, and maybe folks don't know that, but you know, one of my biggest fears for the project was it not working as well as the producers wanted it to, and therefore undermining the opportunities for others to be able to have their experiments funded. You know, like, what a tragic thing if they would have put all their trust on the line and the film wouldn't have been anything or enough. And then that has the opposite effect. And so, yeah, it was all photographs, and which was the only way I know how to do it. And I say that to Joss, like, I know how to write a visual script, but like the language script is something that, you know, like I think visually, and she's like, "Whoa, just do it that way then." And
Did you literally go out in your camera and take new, or was it some of this?
Oh no, they're
like
imaginary images. So the first treatment we made was an edit of the film, like an actual full edit, and all of the cards in the edit were images. Then developed that one further to every image had the camera movement. Because, of course, Elwood looks through the world optimistically. That's a very specific way of looking at people in the eye in certain ways and looking at their body and things moving. And then, of course, Turner looks at the world quite differently, more cynically, more strategically. You can execute that visually. I've looked at the world in both of those ways, and I know the way that I looked at the world, so give that to them. And then we went from there to adapt it to a language that's more accessible for the producers and everyone else that's going to be in the reading process. And then we begin to build the characters out with the sort of emotional trends or the emotional connections that will be happening across scenes. So the idea, I would say, originally came from finding out that Mad Max was visualized in that way. And I was like,
I'm
George,
sorry, it's just funny. I don't obviously, he's a great filmmaker too.
Yeah,
It's like I didn't have Mad Max on my on my list of Nickel Boys influences.
I was like, George Miller did it. Maybe I can. Yeah.
And the idea is that story will come, like if you get that emotional point of view, if you get that part, story will fill it. You know,
Yeah.
you guys can always kind of go back and figure out, okay, we might need a little something here, but like if you can get that emotional layer there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think vision is emotional.
Yeah.
You know? And so the emotional continuity we were looking for was something it took a while for us to articulate, which stems from us wanting to sort of like just what is at the core of Nickel Boys, Coulson's Nickel Boys, right? It's really difficult because it's like replete with gestures and symbols, and it's a complex thing. And what we figured out was that it was, for lack of a better word, it was love. And it was Hattie giving love to Elwood, Elwood being open to the love of Martin Luther King, him taking in Martin Luther King's love, and then Hattie giving a little bit of love to Turner on that trip that she comes, Turner being open to Elwood then, and then them starting to transfer a type of intellectual and relational love that they never had before. And then it kind of like continues through the film. And with those sort of pillars, then we're allowed to sort of organize scenes around ensuring that happens, you know, or that's happening.
Elwood is a great character, and so he'd be a great character for anybody.
Mm-hmm.
But he strikes me as being a very important character for you in terms of a way into this, in the way that his eyes, even in the midst of this hell, his eyes go towards the poetic. His mind goes towards the possibilities. In fact, the most heartbreaking thing would be if he lost hope.
Yeah.
You know, and I wonder if, because I know there is an element here, this is a brutal story, and you don't want to sugarcoat that, but at the same time, you don't want to live in, I know that was a big thing, not to live in the brutality of this.
I love that you're asking this question, Chris, because at some point, after reading the book or even writing the script with Joss, you know, I was like, Joss, we have to make sure that we're not rushing towards Elwood's death. You know, like one would think that every single thing you do in the film is supposed to get you to have his death be the most impactful thing. And with those decisions, you tend to like reduce the life because you're looking for the things that add to this. And the poetic approach to me is accidentally more powerful because then it fulfills the person that's synchronizing their gaze with Elwood, with the actuality of subjectivity for that person. Like, it's really difficult for us to engage with another subjectivity. It's actually impossible. And so poetry, specific language of a person, is in a way proof of their individuality. And so to be able to add the poetry that I've always felt looking at my body and looking around the world to the characters of Elwood and Turner is that. Obviously, point of view, entering, you know, a film that embodies the way that someone sees something, that the character and the visual style is, or even a sense of subjectivity is not something new. Shooting point of view it's not new. It's like literally one of the rules. They show you in my Hitchcock class, they showed us Lady of the Lake, and they're like, yeah, you don't do this. You don't do this. You got to get the reaction shot, you know, and there's film school reasons why you don't do this. And it does present challenges, but I'm wondering, again, not that we want to enter the subjectivity or even the point of view, but that idea of a first person camera. I'm wondering if you could talk about that and those decisions, because I'm sure what I'm saying to you is something you've been hearing probably for what? Like, well, honestly, like I just answered the question, but no one's asked it again in a different way to get deeper, and I appreciate it because there's so much there. First, I'll say that the reason I don't think, you know, Hardcore Henry and Lady in the Lake and some of these other films did POV to the extent that, and we call it sentient perspective. We say POV because if we say sentient perspective, people are like, excuse me, just to give someone something closer. The reason why I think that those maybe aren't what we did was because they're formal conceits. And it reads like ours is a formal conceit, but it's not. That's just the best way of being attached to attention, which is attached to consciousness, which is attached to the way in which someone inhabits the visual field and inhabits space. One of the lines we had on our manifesto, Jomo and I, and Sam, who was also an operator, was there are no scenes and there's no direction for the audience. There's no direction for the characters to face. Like, we're in there with them. They're not pointing towards us. And of course that seems strange because you're looking directly into the camera. But Hamish Linklater famously in one of the interviews was like, I didn't know where the hell the camera was. And it was confusing at first. And then, it was kind of a relief. But I think the true purpose of the POV is to point to the core reasons, the core aspect of our understanding of the world, which is like each one of us being the center of it. And I think there's something about being able to prove that, which I feel like is just like one of the answers to our selfishness,
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, you brought up Jomo, and it's funny, I interviewed him for All Dirt Road Stays the Salt. Brilliant guy. And it was one of these things, like the ideas that were attached to the images. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I wonder what he's doing next. And I looked, I was like, oh, him and RaMell. Yeah. Like, those are some conversations. He's also just an incredible cinematographer beyond that. Because again, it's not simply, this is what Elwood sees, this is what Turner sees. I'm wondering how you guys thought about developing that language, because I read somewhere you wanted it to be like, I think, in the body or something like this. And like, I think one of you had even said at one point, like the idea that this person could be hurt, like this can't, because it could be gimmicky, right? It could be gimmicky. Here comes the door, it's like that idea. And I'm wondering, because I imagine the ideas are there, but the execution's something that you had to really think about, because that's totally related to where we are with these people, right?
The problem, one of the issues I've always had with films in general is the erasing of authorship, with like the author name being behind it, but then every image seeming objective, And so there's like a bizarre truth that is presented, but then claimed not later. And people, I don't even know if we're able to really tell the difference. But in photographing in HALE County and having the camera as an organ, which I like to call it, I came to understand that like I needed to move the camera in a way in which my authorship was legible through the movement of the camera and the image, so that my way of looking became, it was a truth that was only through my way of looking, which maybe pointed to a larger truth, but then the authorship was not written on the credit, which leads to POV, right? Like if you put your hand in front of the camera and do the thing, it looks like a person is looking. And that authorship of point of view is also something that is generally absent. So I think it's more about the history of photography, its capacity to make things seem objective, objectify people at great social expense. And I think in terms of how Jomo and I developed it, Jocelyn Barnes in HALE County was like, RaMell, you have to edit the film, but I think you need help. And trust Joss. And I'm like, okay, but she's like, we need an editor that will meet you where you are. That's not catching up, because then they're going to be suggesting things and you're just going to be frustrated. And so I didn't think that there was going to be a cinematographer that I could meet who could meet me where I'm at. And not because they're not some of the most brilliant artists in the world, like Achivo or whoever, right? It's more that I've been thinking very specifically about the world in images. And I told Joe when we first met, like, I'm just going to have to shoot the whole thing, And he's like, okay. Like he was just open to collaborating. And obviously I didn't even come close to shooting the whole thing, or, and Jomo is the DP. But working with Jomo was so beautiful because within 5 minutes of talking, I knew that he was going to be the guy. But I also didn't know that he was going to contribute. He was going to advance the idea as much as he did. So when we're shot listing, we're, as I said, images, camera movement, then more traditional script. And then we shot listed from the more traditional script. So then we took my DSLR and spent a month in his hotel room doing the scenes. And so, we're practicing the hug. I go up to Jomo. I kind of move over. maybe it should be Steadicam, can't be Steadicam, has to like feign the movement of the camera. Like in the documentary world, someone's moving, it goes here. And then, we sort of realized, it was evident in the way in which we were shooting, that the further away from actually trying to do human vision, the better. We just need to focus in on very specific things about human vision, which is just attention-based. And do we want to fully mimic the neck? Like, how do we turn the camera to the right and to the left to see something? How do we look down when we're evading eye contact? How do we find someone's face and then move away a little bit and then come back? When someone's talking to us and we zone out, do we just rack focus out, gets blurry, then we rack focus back to their face? Or do we duck the camera? How many times can we duck the camera before they're like, gimmick? You know what I mean? Those types of questions were relatively worked out. We knew how we were going to approach the actual on-the-day thing. And then, of course, on the day, everything changes because of filming. And that was maybe the funnest part.
It's funny because, what the brain does to the image. It's fun. I think you've taught before too. I remember the first time you have a bunch of students and they grab a camera, like, I want it to be like how it is when I'm running. Yeah. And they quickly realize, you got a stabilizer in there.
Yeah.
It's like,
we are the first Steadicam.
Yeah. But what about that idea of strapping the camera on?
Mm-hmm.
Did that become part of this?
Yeah. It's funny. Like, there are 3 operators. There's like Sam, Jomo, me, and then we're like, oh, shoot, it's actually Ethan and Brandon. Oh, shoot, it's actually David, too.
In the sense that the actors that play Turner and...
Yeah.
So because they did do some operating themselves.
Yeah. We couldn't get the camera close enough to them with the size of it, even though we shot with the Sony Venice on Rialto mode and it was like really relatively small and light. We couldn't get it close enough to feign the POV that we'd like. And so, Jomo knows all the tricks, knows everything, had his boy build this rig, specialized it a couple times and changed the weight dynamics. So then we had the guys wearing the camera. And essentially, I directed their body and their hands, and then they acted with their hands and tried to communicate true emotion through it, which was a really interesting process. And I think one of the most challenging, and shout out to David Diggs, is wearing the rig that he did.
Yeah, why did you do that? Because it's behind him.
Yeah.
It took me. I had to go see the movie twice to pick up on everything.
Yeah.
But it is when we go to the older character, it is.
Yeah, Adult Elwood is.
It's like the Spike Lee shot almost.
Yeah. It has a formal spiritual reason. Mm-hmm. Should I reveal?
Please, yeah. I love the way you connect your ideas to the choices.
Yeah, it came about because when Jomo and I are actually executing what's on the script, we realized that it's going to be too confusing if we use the camera in the same way when we jump forward in time. That could be the tipping point for persons like, I have no idea what's going on. We're not even. Yeah. Okay. And so I don't know camera stuff. Like, I know photography things, like Jomo's, film. And he's like, we've got this thing, we've got this thing, we've got this type, maybe what about this type of POV? There's also this thing called the Snorri cam. And, it's a thing that goes up on people's faces when they're in chaotic moments. And then we're like, well, in HALE County, I followed Daniel over the shoulder during a basketball scene. And also, I shot an entire basketball game of Daniel on the bench over the shoulder. And it's actually quite nice to be grounded like that. And we realized we could run full scenes that way. And then we kind of both, I think, looked at each other in the same way. And we're like, wow, what happens when a person takes on another person's identity? What happens when their earth is shattered? What happens when they're forced to kind of see themselves going through the world? They're almost disembodied. What a beautiful idea. The second that Adult Elwood has to become the Adult Elwood from this deep, tragic thing that happens when they're on the run, if he's separated from himself. Right. And then, obviously, over the course of the end of the film, he returns to himself through the love of his partner. And so it made so much sense, It
did. It's beautiful. It's one of those things. I think people would be interested by that answer, but you emotionally feel what you said. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I think sometimes with these things, people think you're supposed to decode it or something.
No.
And it's about how you feel.
But this is like the old POV thing, is they're formal conceits. They're doing something because the form is interesting. Our source always has to be the intent and the sort of spiritual underpinnings of its relationship to the grander project. And I think if that's the case, then POV would have worked back then. Because you're making different decisions.
In Hale County, one, I think, the things, and it's simple, but it was profound, living in a shot. And I think that's the extension of like, how can I make a living photograph? I wanted to talk about coverage in that sense with this movie, because a lot of that does carry over here. And I heard you had a ton of footage. I mean, your editor said you had a ton of footage. So I didn't hear, they said it. But were you still thinking in that sense of the one image, the one frame, or did you allow yourself to think in terms of coverage? You know, is it a lot of footage because you're trying different things of different versions of the same thing, or did you give yourself some options in the editing room to do something?
It was really funny. It's a tough. I mean, as you all can imagine, seeing the film, it's a tough sell. You know, everything's a oneer. Yeah, you know,
that is the case. Okay,
and that's terrifying to the studio. And it's kind of the only way it was possible, we thought. You know, the reason why there's so many images were written and conceived and shot was because all those were necessary images. We didn't shoot one that we thought wasn't going to be in the film if it was done right and can contribute to the scope of this person's humanity or the scope of their integration into the world. And then obviously when the edit comes, putting the things beside each other, you can only predict that so much. And it changes the valence of something that's coming up. It alters what you read before. And then you also realize something which is really hard, I think, for filmmakers to do. And, you know, shout out to Nick Monsour, our editor. What an incredible editor he is. You know, sometimes less is more, you know. In making HALE COUNTY, RaMell Ross, he was like, what kind of film do you want to make? Art film or doc film? Not that it can't be both, but how do you want to categorize? Eventually came to doc, you know, all the reasons why I think so. And then he was like, we need to strip it down. The images are powerful, they're doing their thing, but the more there are, the more people don't remember them, the more you lose the emotional thread because of what's overwhelming. And that's something that we have to test on ourselves and be honest. But you want to have it as full as possible. So that means you need as much material as possible.
It's funny. This might sound like a bad example, but I remember Damien Chazelle, everybody credited Whiplash for being great, really well edited. He's like, that wasn't hard to edit. He was like, those long takes in La La Land, that was a bitch.
Yeah,
you know, because
exactly.
it was that thing where it was, and I know those are very different types of movies.
No, but I'm with you. Like, yeah.
He's like, you know, rhythm, violence, boom, boom, boom. Yeah. He's like, suddenly, like that rhythm of how you go from one shot to the other shot and how that all plays, and you take one out, and suddenly the rhythms, you know, it's like, he's like, that is really hard.
And it's so underknown, and you need good people. Like, the reason why this film's successful, and the same reason why HALE COUNTY is successful, is because trusted and wise and brilliant people in the industry were on my team. And they advocated for me, and they gave me their ideas. Very early on in shooting, Dee Dee, after a couple of dailies come back, Dee Dee calls me, and she's like, you have to do 2 versions of your scenes. You have to do a scene in which you actually do it as long as you want, because as you know, these scenes are long to me, and I'm like, we'll do it 15 minutes if that's how long it takes to feel like we've gotten some progress with, and it's just a wonder, and that's just it. The film's gonna be 5 hours. You guys don't mind, right? She's like, it makes sense on paper, but if you only have this scene at this length in the edit, it's going to be impossible. Like, you're going to be pigeonholed into a certain emotional valence. You need to be able to accomplish the same thing that you want in this scene in just a shorter period of time. So figure that out, so that while you're editing with Nick, you have the option of getting to something faster and not losing a person, because while you were shooting, you knew that it was going to work. And that was hard to hear, because I knew it was going to work. But then I thought about it, obviously, and she was 100% right. And then we immediately started to make adjustments, Jomo and I, and trying to have our timings just be a little bit different and maybe lose a little bit of the scene in order to just ensure that the film wasn't going to break in the edit, because everything was just too long. And then we would have to chop the scenes up in ways that weren't authentic to the previsioned vision, which would have ruined it, you know?
With something like this where you're watching things over and over again, do you lose the objectivity of how something feels? Do you know that sense?
Yeah.
Do you know, in that sense of like, you're trying to elicit emotion from something and you're making these choices. I imagine that becomes harder and harder because you're doing a technical task and you're watching it. It's like how do you know?
I love your questions, Chris, because my first thought was like, no, of course. Like, I'm in it the whole time. And then I'm like, good question, Chris. Actually, yeah, you do. You do. Like, you have to.
Is this a movie that you had to screen?
We didn't. We could. I mean, it was impossible because people's reactions would be so polarizing. I mean,
Right.
it's polarizing while we're editing the film. Like it's not, and we're not all on the same page all the time.
Right.
We're trying to figure out how each of us view the thing. One of my favorite things to say is like, if you're making a film, make sure you have people that are smarter than you making it with you. If not, you're in trouble because we think we know. And then when we talk to 3 other people whose opinions we respect, whose work we respect, and they all tell us something different, then we're forced to contend with what we thought we know. And maybe we were right, and then we can push for it. But you need the contrast. And in the edit, we get that. Like, we're getting the pushback. This isn't working. This is working. Yeah. And that's kind of how the film's made.
How did you approach with your team the sense of, and maybe there isn't a distinction, what it feels like when we're in Turner's and where we are when we're in Elwood's? Like, was there things in terms of movement or even like what was in frame? Or is it that Turner learns to see like Elwood, and so therefore that's the connective tissue?
It is that Turner learns to see as Elwood. At times we do want you to not know who's looking because we want you to understand that it could be both, or maybe they're the same person, like, to keep it open. But I learned, I think very early on, sometimes it's best not to say everything. And it may seem not true because even in this interview, it seems like I'm saying everything. It's like talking so much.
You're doing great.
But
please.
But to overburden.
I'm watching Trevor shake his head over there, nodding. He saw it on Friday night, and he's like, "Yep."
To overburden everyone with the full aim of the scene, and to have everyone included on the conceptual underpinnings of every moment, it like doesn't let them work to their strength, because then they're thinking about things, I think, that are outside of their sort of teleological moment. They're like moment of pure utility and like putting their best into the thing that they do the best, right? And I'm unsure if that's exactly your question, but when we're executing Turner's view, Nora knows that this is...
Nora's your production designer.
Yeah, sorry, Nora Minnis is our production
That was
designer.
one of my questions, is that I was wondering if she's treating a Turner frame different than
She is. Yeah, she is. We're treating not the colors, but, of course, the objects and what we'll be seeing.
But there's something here, because there is something, and we were talking about this, it's like, you think of a photograph as being objective, like here's the way thing, and it's like, no, it's like what you see and how your mind organizes things.
But people think that it's already there. So, I mean, goes back to the question of whether or not photography is art, like undermining painting, because, all art, Christian art, is based on labor. It's based on how much time you spent sketching the thing, and that's the skill, that's the craft, that's the art, and that's also the vision, because you have the eye to see it. And then photography undermines that by producing something that's equally as seemingly curated and individual, but mechanically. So it gets really confusing.
Take me through the logic, the initial logic and the approach for archival and how that fits into it. Because, right, that's early in the recipe of things that, am I right about that?
Oh, yeah. And in the first visual script.
Okay.
Yeah. The archival is, I think, first and foremost, just a way to expand meaning. And I've never understood why archival is not used in the way in which it's used in Nickel Boys. So, of course, my first opportunity, I'll use it, which is using it, I'm saying, in more commercial spaces, because the stuff that is happening in Nickel Boys has happened relatively forever in the art world and like video art, like talk about real experimentation. The archive, one, allows someone to not remain in the fantasy exchange that happens when you're watching a historical piece that's drama, that's based on a true story. Like, it's always fundamentally compartmentalized, no matter how well the film is, to this studio arts, this like, film space. And the archival is, one, just a grounding reminder. It almost is like the ground, like you have like a neutral, a wire that's attached to you to outside. An archival comes up, and you're like, oh yes, there is the ground outside in the earth. You use archival images like one would a note in music, or as one would a flare on a painting. Then you're speaking to the visual world in a way, I think, that's so visceral and unconscious to the viewer, because it breaks that false true, that nonfiction fiction dichotomy that's been built up over culture over time, which doesn't really exist, we kind of know, but necessary for the industry. Wanted to do that, and wanted to do that in the context of Black subjectivity, and sort of rescue I say rescue folks from the archive. We know the power dynamics of the camera. We know that the majority of images of Black people, at least American Black people, have been made by white people. One can imagine the consequences of that. Maybe someone needs an analogy of what if every image of an American was made by a British? Do you think that we would look like we think we look? We would look like fools because maybe that's what they think of us. And so to think about the way in which folks have been documented over time, generally speaking, by white folks, and to find moments in this documentation that removes the utility of that documentation, where there's like, I hate to use the word humanity because it's so rote, but where there's a glimmer of personhood in the subjective view, where they glance at the camera in a really fascinating way, or they like forget, they like trip over something, and you're like, whoa, I saw that person. You know, like, oh, there's the person. I didn't even know that wasn't the person.
And you asked for that, right? You went to your archivist and I want a tripping. I want to look in the camera.
Oh, I have like a laundry list of like random thought archivals, which are impossible, right? But our 3 archival producers were Allison Brandon, Alex Westfall, and Gala Prudent. Gala started, Alex took over, and Allison was the sort of original. But she started, when we started the writing process, we hired Allison. It was, a friend of Joss, had worked in the doc world. So she had been culling images and archives for 4 years. And we're just looking through and stuff, trying to find esoteric caches and trying to find the gems of subjectivity in an imbalanced power dynamic.
Is there an aspect of the archive then that is also the history, the history of the I don't want to say reform school. What do we even call this?
No, yeah. I love that you're hesitant to say that.
I don't know what the hell do you call this hellish jail that they put these boys in.
This murderous reform school,
But I mean,
yeah.
Because I'm remembering a picture of Hamish in a newspaper article, so I don't want to misremember it. But there are things, because they're right, you want to mix in a little of the documentation?
There are the real like anytime you see something about burial or earth, they're the real images that were in the original Dozier report of the grave sites. There are, when Elwood is being beat and those images come up, those are images of the real boys that were at the Dozier School for Boys. We really mined I think it's the Memory Florida Archive, which is where a lot of this stuff is kept. Of course, there's also images from, news footages of MLK's funeral, and you see Coretta Scott King. There's footage of space. That type of documentation is interesting. It's like the film we're trying to like, in some sense, create the most contemporary document and apply the most contemporary, and not for the sake of the most, but just like the most recent that we could consider the most recent visuality of sort of Black culture. And my favorite inclusion, though, of archival is images from the Black family archives, of course, which are, Bell Hooks would say, the only side of resistance to those other types of archival images and the other images of Black folks. And so there's a counterpoint of images that are older that are from Black folks' home video cameras and kids playing and all of the things that, are joyous memories of what a life is and could be.
I don't want to dwell on this because you don't dwell on it.
Let's dwell.
What happens is horrid. What's happened in the history here. And some of that you can't avoid. But formally, I mean, both from a story standpoint, like how to craft this thing so that the audience understands, but also not spending too much time on it. But also, when there are these moments when they're beating the kids, it feels to me like sound becomes, you don't want to show it, you don't want to recreate it. It feels like, and then almost it felt like also like whenever they approach danger, it felt like music was enough, right? I wonder if you could talk about, because I know that was an issue. I know that's an issue. I didn't get to see you and Barry talk yesterday, but I know this is something he struggled with Underground Railroad too, which is like, I don't want to do more. I don't want to create more of these images. Telling the story. So I'm wondering, like, formally, how you handled that and thought about it.
Like, I wonder what this film would be if Barry hadn't done what he'd done, because Barry's, the viscerality of what he did was like the next level of, wow, like cinema's never given care to the Black pain enough to like sort of do those things. And so I always say that the film is just contingent on all of these masterpieces, you know, to like, that's been done. So what's like the next version of it? And in sound, we're trying so hard to be aware of what our consciousness wants and actually does, and thinking about trauma. And I've had trauma of various degrees, a lot of like broken bones and dislocated shoulders. And every time that that's happened to me, I'm not looking at it. You know, I'm not looking at my shoulder. Like I glance at it, oh my God, that's horrible. I'm like focusing on little details. I also hear so many things, and those things become the soundtrack to the pain. They also help me deal with it because I can like focus in on something that's sort of outside of me. And we wanted to bring that. We also know that, you know, specifically from like 4th of July celebrations, like any person that's been in the military and been near bombs and war, like when they hear these firecrackers or even gang violence, or, I mean, they are out of their mind, you know, like they are, and one can only imagine what's going on inside their head and their body. They're responding to that same trauma. It takes them back, just like the smell does, and all of a sudden they're just activated. And so, how do you do that? How do you do that in film? You know, we like, you know, Jocelyn and I like to say that we wanted HALE County to have its own memory, its own audio memory. And so, thinking about consciousness in film, how do you kind of give that memory to space and time in a film and have music intertwined with the organic sounds that are happening in the world in a way in which you don't know which is which, and each one could be a site for trauma at any time. And then also with the way that the camera is moving, you're forcing violence to be anticipated in an interesting way because you're so locked into their perspective, you just don't know when it's going to come.
I find the anticipation worse as a viewer.
Yeah.
You know?
Because that's the worst thing for human beings. You know, like knowing that you're going to get a beating in an hour and then having to walk and like get in the car, just beat me now. Beat me, like why? You know, and you just don't know if it's going to happen, if he's going to get hit. And yeah.
A great author. I'm wondering, was this just like, go for it, you know, or what was that like? Or was he a resource that you actually leaned on beyond his incredible book?
I sent him an email. He was very hands off with Barry.
We should say he wrote Underground Railroad. We should just say, yeah.
My shorthand in these interviews needs to get.
I think most people know that, but we'll be careful.
I didn't realize he had the kind of, I mean, in the talk I did with Barry yesterday, because I tell people, I'm like, yeah, I wrote Colson this like long email, like I always wanted to be a writer, like all these things. Thank you so much. And he wrote back like, really appreciate it, man. Good luck. You know, like, and then of course immediately you're like, he hates me. You're
interpreting every word.
Yeah. You're just like rereading the like 6 words, and you're like, maybe it's a code. You know, his books are coded.
Don't fuck it up, kid.
Yeah. You highlight the whole thing to see if he wrote that in like white and you could see it. And then you realize that he's just genuinely wishing you luck. And he was writing a book and Barry wrote him a very similar email, and he wrote back something like, go get him, kid, or like, yo, you got this, or something. And then that was it. And I really appreciated it because I don't know.
Were you nervous to show it to him? Did you show it to him? I imagine that's got to be, you're off with this thing for 3 years. Did you?
I just know that he's writing a book right now and like doesn't want to be bothered,
you
know? And like,
all right.
I imagine myself being that type of writer if I was good enough to write.
The word groundbreaking is something that gets so overused. And one of the few things that I've seen that have actually been groundbreaking that did something new, that had ideas, was HALE County. And I have to admit, I was a little bit nervous with the idea of you doing a literary adaptation. And I am blown away that it was actually a step, that somehow you could bring what you were doing into this. I don't think we've seen anything like this before. And it's a beautiful piece of work. And really, I'm like proud. Like I've never been proud. It's like, you know, like the HALE County guy did it, you know, it's like, cause it's like, and I don't mean to, that sounds patronizing. I don't mean it that way, but it's just like, I couldn't tell you, I've already seen it twice, and I just, congratulations on it.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I will give a super shout out to, in general, the collaborative process, but like all of the department heads and everyone, and Anjanou and the actors, because
it's weird for you because it's usually the HALE County. It's like a photograph. It's like it's you.
I know, that's what I'm saying.
Right? Like you've never worked with a production designer before.
I thought I was gonna have to do everything. I was like, Joss, I don't know how am I gonna, and she's like, we're gonna find people. And I'm like, do they exist? And she's like, of course, you know? And I tend to work by myself. So this was, I mean, I feel like it was even a lot of trust on my part, But not only was it earned, I was just like so surprised. And so everyone brought their game. Anjanou and Brandon and Ethan. No one's acted like this before since like Lady in the Lake or something. I don't know how they came in and just like switched up their modes to do it. We don't have much time. We didn't rehearse. It is on the day. We have 2 hours. We got to get this shot in 2 hours. They showed up.
All right. Well, congratulations.
Thanks, Chris.